Hey everyone, it's GM Max here, and in this video I'm going to share with you my blitz session that I played on January the 4th, 2021, where you'll be able to see my thought process on my games, and also see for yourself how I managed to get over 2900 chess.com blitz again. So let's get into the games. The first game that we have here is a game where playing white is no draw nub against me playing with the black pieces. So let's see how the game went. It went e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, and the Rosaline's opening that I found a little bit annoying in the past. In fact, I actually recommended my attacking the Sicilian repertoire for white. So in this game, I decided to play the move e5. A somewhat unusual move, but I had seen Carlsen play it in a lot of games, going for this funny bishop d6 and playing it in a really creative fashion. So after e5, my opponent played the move c3, which I think if you're going to play this, it's better to castle first and wait to see what exactly black is going for this up first. Because now after c3, I played the move of knight f6, which shows a little disadvantage of white's play in that this pawn is under attack and he doesn't have the option to defend it with a move like rook to e1, which he would have if he had played castles and then gone for c3 by comparison. My opponent defended the pawn with the move queen e2. Maybe you're still hoping to go for d4. But now bishop d6, and you might be wondering, okay Max, why are you blocking in your d-pawn like this? Well, the answer is that it's actually only a temporary block, because after castles, and now my opponent's weird move of knight to a3, well, I retrieved the bishop with bishop c7, and now my pawn is ready to move forward and to simply take over the center with all these pawns side by side. Now, after knight c4, I decided to play a solid move in this position, but actually there was a better move that I could have played. Well, actually a few moves maybe that were better. Probably the best move was actually to play something like d5 and just get rid of this pawn in the center. And I mean, if they do play ed5, I kind of saw a little bit too late that I'm actually not forced to take on d5 here. And I can play this move e4, and you end up sacking some material, but you get a very strong attack in return. So it would have been a very nice idea, but okay, I didn't see it. And I settled for the move of d6, simply saying, well, okay, the knights look a little bit silly, while black has a very solid structure, and suddenly black's position feels rather harmonious. So after d3, I played move h6, just stopping any pins with bishop to g5. And after knight e3, I came up with a maneuver that is not really necessary here, but it's quite a thematic one in these typical e4, e5 type of positions. Probably the best move is just to play bishop e6 and, maybe play on the queen side from there with a6 and b5, since white's knights have moved a lot of times without really achieving all that much. But instead I played the move knight to e7. And the idea of knight e7 is simply to maneuver my knight towards the king side, while leaving that bishop sort of hitting mid-air as such. Admittedly, it's not the best move, but it worked out pretty well in the game. After a4, I continued with knight to g6, continuing my plan. And my opponent here tried a little bit too hard to attack me. I thought that they would play to move bishop c4 and try to stop me taking over the center with d5. Instead, though, my opponent played knight f5, going for some sort of attempt to attack my king. What's the move that you think I played as black here in this position? Well, congratulations if you found the move of d5. If you want to play a6 and then d5, that's also a very strong continuation. You also get full marks from me. Well, we see the idea of d5 is that clearly white can't take the pawn because that pawn is stuck defending the knight from capture. But the problem is if you let black play a6 next move, then black will simply win the bishop on b5. So we can see just how badly white's attempt to play creatively has gone wrong here. Game saw a5, which at least saves the bishop, but I do get a free pawn. And in desperation, my opponent tried to confuse the issue, playing the move b4. But after takes and captures, well, black is simply up 2 pawns for nothing. But there was some little excitement that you will see after bishop b2, d4, and rook fb1. I was a little bit nervous about some tactics like bishop takes d4 and discovering an attack on my undefended bishop on b4. I ended up playing the move knight to f4, but I didn't follow it up in the very best way. After queen d1, the best way to convert my advantage is simply to take the knight, and in that way I can retreat my bishop later to make sure that pawn is well defended. Because that knight f5 is white's only really active piece at the moment. So really trading it does make a lot of sense, and moves like queen d6 even to keep everything defended would be a very practical choice for black here. Instead I played bishop c5, and I admit bishop c5 was a blunder. I just completely forgot that after playing knight f4 that my e5 pawn is no longer defended. Luckily for me, it's still winning for black anyway because of the move bishop f5. And after move ef5, I then went ahead with queen d5, forking the knight and also threatening mate with queen takes g2. So my opponent played knight f3 to defend the knight. I played queen takes f5, realizing that knight takes d4 doesn't really have the desired effect. If you want, you can try and figure out why exactly knight d4 is a mistake, what tactic I had planned if white did play this move. Well, the answer is that I can simply play bishop takes d4, and then play an idea that we saw just a couple of moves ago in queen d5 and the threat of mate, and the attack on the bishop does win me a full piece here, as you can see. Instead, we had bishop c4 in the game. I played rook f8, realizing that they can't take on d4 because I'm going to have knight e2 forks in a lot of cases then. So bishop a3 was played. Takes. I played a solid defensive move of rook to e7, simply defending my pawns from attack. After all, I'm 2 pawns up, and it will be nice to get some play down that open e-file as well. And white's lost, but you decide to accelerate his defeat with the move knight takes d4. And okay, it's a pawn grab, but the problem with this pawn grab is that now we have some loose pieces that are bound to drop off. And the move queen c5 is just very strong here. Where, I mean, if you play a move like knight to c2, then you're just asking for the pieces just to flood in the attack with rook e2, and once that f2 pawn falls, the white king is ripe for the taking. Instead, he played knight f3, and after queen a3, my opponent resigned. And with that, we can see that this was a pretty convincing win by me, where I was just able to play very classically in the center, punish some tactical mistakes by my opponent, and then secure the win. So I'm just going to save this game now because I will be sharing it with my patrons later. I'll tell about this special opportunity at the end of the video. But for now, let's get into the next game, where I played a rematch against this player, No Draw Nub. In case you're wondering, his rating at chess.com is 2532. What I found with the chess.com ratings is that, at least at these high levels, that generally the players, let's say, usually rate 300 points higher than their FIDE rating. So we can say this opponent is about a 200-ish sort of level, roughly. So in any case, in this game, with me playing the white piece against No Draw Nub playing as black, we had knight f6. I went back to an old favourite of mine in the London system with bishop f4, d5 and e3. And after c5, well, I recently actually published a file on the Jababa London for white for my chess improvement system members. So I thought, well, why not make use of this knowledge? And I played the move knight to c3, transposing the Jababa attack where you have the knight on c3 with bishop on f4. And what black should do is he should simply take, and then play a6, and, I've shared this before with, my chess improvement system members that, if black meets knight f3 with knight c6, and then knight e5 with bishop d7, that black does equalize here, because the knight on c3 is not really ideally placed in this Carlsbad structure. In general, you would prefer to have the pawn on c3 and the knight on d2, so that you can keep a very nice healthy pawn chain from b2 to d4, to also anchor that strong knight on e5. Fortunately, my opponent didn't really know what to do against this transposition, and the result is after a6. I was able to take this pawn and have a very good position. Although after e6, I did admittedly forget the move that I should play here. Do you know those times where you sort of play a bad move, but your opponent makes a worse mistake and you get rewarded for it? Well, that's what happened in this game, where what I should do is I should play the move knight to a4, and then after, let's say, bishop takes c5, knight c5, queen a5, well, this tactic does allow black to regain his piece. Unfortunately for him, after knight to f3, white is still slightly better because of this very powerful unopposed dark squared bishop and this general bishop pair advantage. We can see that, well, black's dark squares are a little bit tender in this structure. Instead, I played b4, and then at this point, unfortunately, b4 is a mistake because of the very typical idea of b6, which simply wins back the pawn. I don't really have a good way to defend it. In the game, I tried to make the best of it by playing knight a4, and, well, it turned out better than I could possibly have imagined. Do you think that you can find the best move that my opponent should have played at this point? Okay, well, in the game he blundered. What he should have done is he should have played b takes c5. I was going to play knight takes c5, but the problem with this is that you can see that this queenside formation is very rickety for white, and if black plays knight b d7, he's ready to win back the pawn with knight d7. And then bishop takes b4 check, and only then take the knight. And then my king will lose the right to castle, and it's clear white's position is a complete mess. So I would basically have to either give back the pawn or play some move like knight d3, but knight d3 is very awkward and it's clear that black, even moves like e5 and knight e4 is going to have an incredibly strong initiative for the pawn, whereas white is a long way from getting the pieces developed properly. Fortunately for me, I was rewarded for my bad play because he played knight bd7, and then after c6, black's position is clearly gone quite wrong, where actually he resigned at this point because knight b8 runs into c7 and I win the piece. But in fact, it was much too early for my opponent to resign because even though he's losing a piece, he actually does get some compensation for it. In the game, I was expecting him to play e5 and kind of accept the material loss, but it turns out that actually bishop a4 is not 100% clear. Because after c3 and bishop a5, black does have some compensation based on the fact that, he does have a lot of pressure coming against that c3 pawn. And I still haven't really developed my pieces fully at this point. Probably the best option is to play bishop d3 and just try to consolidate as soon as possible. But black is definitely not without his chances, and it's fair to say that it was much too early for black to resign in this position after c6. So it's a valuable lesson of, don't resign until you really are 100% sure that the position is dead lost. Like, if you're at the point where, say, you are playing against your Grandmaster coach or against the Indian, and you're 100% sure that you would beat them from that position, then yeah, maybe you resign there, but otherwise, play on to the bitter end. You'd be surprised how many points I've won just by continuing to fight when all hope seemed lost. So alright, I'm going to save this game, and now let's continue to the next opponent that I played in this blitz session. This was an anonymous grandmaster with the username Floaty Potato, with chess.com rating over 2900, and I'm sure I'm really excited to see how I went against this player. I have to admit, this was kind of a funny match, because actually I struggled quite a lot with the white piece against him, but he also struggled a lot against me when he was playing with white. So it's kind of one of those weird situations where, you're meant to have the first move advantage of the white pieces, but it doesn't always work out that way, depending on who you play. So in this game, my opponent played French defense with e6, d4, d5. I decided to play an alternative repertoire that I had shown for one of my repertoire courses, and played the move ed5 and knight f3. And actually, admittedly, the opening kind of went quite well for me in this game, because after knight f6, bishop d3, and bishop to d6, well, I got to show off a nice little wrinkle that Magnus Carlsen has played in many games. And that is the move queen e2, where rather than just castling and developing automatically, which sort of leads to a quite boring equality, the move queen e2 instead kind of asks black to figure out a good way to deal with the check. If you played bishop e7, then the bishop is a lot less active than on d6. If you played bishop e6, white can go knight g5 and go after the bishop pair. And in the game, my opponent instead played the move queen to e7. I think bishop e6 was probably the better move, however, because now after queen takes e7, bishop e7, well, white gets a little bit of an initiative here. I played the move bishop to f4 following Carlsen, and after the move c6, I castled. My opponent also castled. And normally white plays rook e1, and that's probably the move I should have played to hit the bishop in this way with tempo. Instead, I put the knight on c3, I guess trying to be creative, but I do think the knight is more flexible on d2 in these structures where he's already kind of put the blot on the knight on c3. After rook e8, I played rook fe1, black played knight b to d7. Actually, the move bishop g4 would have been a kind of interesting move at this point, where it looks a bit weird to play because you're allowing knight e5 with tempo. But after bishop e6, then black can actually trade off that knight and kind of nullify the pressure in this way. It also kind of shuts off the e-file for my rook, so I think that this would have been a way for black to equalize. After knight bd7, I sort of took advantage of this little reprieve to play the move h3, which just takes the sting out of any knight h5 and stops his bishop ever coming to g4 later. So I think it's a quite decent prophylactic move. My opponent now played the knight to f8, and I played the move bishop to e5, just kind of putting the bishop on an annoying square, saying, well, now you wish you had your knight back on d7, bro. But if he does play it, then I can retreat the bishop back and say I sort of gained a half move. So he played knight e6, and I kind of admitted here that my knight is not really doing much on c3. So that's why I decided it was time to improve the worst placed piece with knight e2. I actually think that maybe knight d1 might have been a better maneuver. I didn't think of it during the game, but the idea of bringing knight towards f5 does seem somewhat appealing, even if probably black is still doing fine in any case. The computer incidentally wants to go for rook e3 and then knight e2, which does feel like a slightly more harmonious approach to the position, because knight e2 does block in my rook in the short term. Well, he played the move knight d7. I brought the bishop back to h2. I mean, knight d7 struck me as a little bit of a passive move in the game. We had g6, and I played a4. Not really have any clear plan, but I just remember the computer saying in similar positions that, it's good to grab space on the queen side. And if they play a5, that somehow their structure is less flexible than yours. So I kind of thought, okay, I'll trust the computer on that. I played the move c3 here. Maybe I should have played g4 at this point or a little bit later, because one thing that was sort of lacking was a clear sort of target or clear space to sort of grab here, where I played the move knight e5, which I don't think really did that much. Whereas the move g4 at least grabs a little more space, and I have a plan at least to improve the position with king g2 and knight to f4 in this case. So that's probably how I would play this position on the second go. In the game I played knight e5. He played f6, and I kind of realized that my knight is not really doing all that much on g4. In fact, he didn't even have to play king g7, because knight h6 was kind of an empty threat in any case. Well, after king g7, probably should put the king on f7. Because now after knight f4, at least I can sort of say, in this position, my piece is slightly more active here. And while it shouldn't be anything significant, it's enough that I can try to set some little problems. That was also helped by the fact that my opponent was starting to get behind on the clock at this point compared to me. So he played bishop d7, and, well, we had the interesting question of, well, how do we kind of improve the position before black, simply trades some pieces and just equalizes? I decided to play the move bishop to c7. I mean, I could play the move b3 first just to kill the knight, and maybe that would have been a more effective approach. But this move worked pretty well in the game, because he really should, I think, move the knight in this position. Maybe to c8 to, again, try to kick my bishop away, and then maybe bishop c7 looks a little bit like a wasted tempo, considering that he probably wanted to play knight c8 anyway to improve his worst place piece. But in the end, my inferior move kind of got rewarded with bishop d8, and now at least in this position I can sort of say, well, the bishops are going to get traded, and then I kind of have a better bishop than my opponent. At this point I missed a little trick actually, where I could have played, because I assumed that I have to defend the bishop in some direct way, but actually the move rook e1 would have been quite strong, because after bishop c7, what I had missed is that after rook e1, bishop c7, there's rook e7. And you can see compared to the game that my rook is a lot more actively placed here. Hitting that pawn on b7, pinning up the bishop on f7, and after b3 we see that black is quite passive and definitely has his work cut out in order to save this game. Though maybe knight a8 might allow him to narrowly hold. Well, the game saw bishop d8, rook d8, and, well, now the position starts to become more or less equal. He just plays bishop d7 and is ready to get the rook into the game. But then I was sort of able to outplay my opponent a second time, in fact. After rook e1, I was expecting he would kick my knight at some point, but he played knight c8, which is also fine. Played knight e3, he went knight d6. And now we have this sort of very dry position, but it does spice up in a few moves. So now that I've stopped him playing knight e4, well, he decided to play bishop e6, which I was kind of happy to see, because it felt like a bit of a wasted move to maneuver the bishop like he did. Because I think the bishop's actually a lot better on d7 than it is on f7. Moves like rook e8 and h5 would have struck me as being much more constructive. So now, in these positions where not much is happening, a good approach is to try to grab space. But if you play c4, you can't just weaken the d-pawn for an attack. So I decided to grab space on the king side with g4. And this is where I was able to start to outplay my opponent. So after h4, he realized that the pressure is getting a little bit unpleasant, that, if I can put an knight on f4, then maybe I can go h5 and try to create some weaknesses. Or indeed a move like c4 could also follow at some point. I was expecting my opponent would somehow try to play the b5 push and try to create counterplay on the queen side. But instead he played the move of c5 here. And I don't think I responded to this in the very best way, actually. Probably what I should do here is just consolidate the position with maybe even some move like other than rook d1, which is what the engine suggests, which I don't completely understand the idea. I mean, maybe it's just to, make sure the pawn is defended. But anyway, the idea, I guess, would be a bit more active, would be to play g5 and try to get the knight to e5. It's a plan that does look more constructive. In any case, I played knight g2, which, I mean, it's not a bad move, but it is a little bit slow, I think. And after rook c8, I decided to ignore his ideas of takes and rook c3 and just go for the jugular with knight to f4. Actually, it turns out I should have played rook e7 first, that this would have been a much better move order in comparison. But okay, after cd4 takes and rook c3, well, now I decide to play rook e7, trying to go for some tricks like putting knight on e6 at some point. And it worked quite well, because suddenly my opponent is having to deal with this initiative, which, when you're low on time, is not so easy to do. And, well, he played the move rook takes b3 here, but I think the move he should have played is the move of g5, because it turns out the check on e6 is actually not all that scary. So I mean, he goes king g8, and well, my bishop is under attack as well, so I think that black should be able to hold just by taking the pawns and defending with his pieces around his king. So yeah, that's probably was his best continuation. I will also point out knight h5 would be met with king to f8, where the attack on the rook really does help black out there. So after rook b3, this is what my opponent played, but I think he missed a little intermezzo that I played, which you can see if you can try to find it for yourself here with white to move. So the game went rook to d7, where I simply attacked this knight, and that leads to all kind of bad news, as we'll see. After knight e8, I actually missed a little opportunity, well, actually it turns out the move I played is pretty good as well. I played h5, and suddenly it's very hard for black to deal with this threat to the pawn, and at this point white should definitely be winning here. Unfortunately, after f5, I just completely choked, where, I saw my opponent was low on time, and I kind of allowed it to sort of disrupt my focus and stop me from just playing normal moves. Because in this position, I mean, I just have a very simple and very effective idea of playing g5 that somehow I never really paused to take the time to think about, but, I thought about playing h6 directly, but some idea of playing it more slowly and preparing it just didn't occur to me. I mean, if black plays a move like rook b4, then, I simply can play knight e6, and then knight d8, and, once that bishop falls, it's clear that this is very bad news for black. If rook takes, I can go knight takes, and, well, if takes on h3, I have knight h6, and, it's pretty clear that the end is nigh for black. Either king f8, rook f7, or king h8, I can just go rook d8 and, win the knight and win the game simply. Unfortunately, I did not see this, and instead I just completely self-destructed. Where the move h6 is not terrible, but after king f6, the problem is that the move g5 doesn't really work that well, because black can take and then sort of take the knight and go after my bishop, and things went a bit wrong for white there. I mean, the move that I should play is simply bishop b5. I should simply play this and prepare the idea of just building up my attack, because I mean, I do have ideas of taking d5 and, well, simply being much better in the ending still, thanks to this pawn that, if I get to take the h7 pawn, that pass pawn is a monster. Unfortunately, I completely self-destructed with gf5, and after g5, I'm actually still holding here if I find this move of knight g6. It's kind of weird, I actually saw this move, this was the first move I thought of, but for some weird reason I didn't play it, and I'm not quite sure why, because the other moves are just a lot worse. Because then one key point is after knight g6 that, well, if rook d3, you can go for knight e5, and you sort of end up getting a piece back with tactics with rook 8 d4, and then you have like knight g4, and it's sort of a fancy tactical line, but the end of it, you get to take this pawn, and basically you manage to hold thanks to this counterplay. Because going for king g6 and rook e7 would be quite a lot worse for black, because then his knight is kind of going to drop off after knight f6, and then rook g7 from there. So instead I played bishop c2, which ended up being the final blunder. After rook b2, for some weird reason, I kind of thought that this offered better swindling chances, but yeah, after bishop h5, it's kind of clear that I'm just dead lost. I'm just a piece down, and well, in the game, he managed to put together a nice mating attack with knight e5, king f5, rook h7, knight f6, rook b7, and now bishop g6, just preparing to bring the knight and rook in to go for a rook and knight checkmate, which I'm not really in a good position to avoid here. In fact, in the game, I didn't even really stop this mate, which was a little bit sad. After h7, I ran a knight h5, and yeah, after knight f4, I think you see the mate by now. King g4, rook g2, and so I allowed him to checkmate me. So as you can see, yeah, it was a game which was definitely a little bit frustrating, and I definitely had outplayed my opponent, and then just completely self-destructed, which was very unfortunate as such. The good news is I was able to learn from this game and kind of not repeat the same sort of mistake in the next games at least. So at least it allowed me to kind of improve as I was playing. It's not like the saying, like, even when you lose, you learn something. So, okay, having saved this game, let's move on to the rematch, where, my second game against this opponent. As you'll see, I played this guy quite a few times, and this game, if you like the accelerated dragon, then you're going to absolutely love this game, because that's what I played in this game. Went for e4, c5, knight f3, played hyper-accelerated dragon with g6, hoping he would not play the Alapin and, get me into this position where my bishop looks very unfortunately placed on g7. Luckily for me, he played d4 instead, and we got the accelerated dragon that I was after with knight c6. Now, you might be wondering, well, why didn't you play bishop g7 first, Max? The reason is that when I play c4, there's a system I like to play called the Gurgenidze, where I went knight f6, knight c3, and the reason behind delaying the move bishop g7 like I've done here is that I want to avoid white playing the move bishop e3, because now I can go knight g4 and start harassing his bishop. If you try to move the bishop, then queen b6 is leading to all kinds of nasty attacks on the white pawns. So based on that, my opponent of course knew this and decided to avoid this with the move bishop to e2. I continued with knight takes d4, and the idea behind this early knight exchange is I managed to avoid a position where my opponent would be able to take back with bishop takes d4. You see, a general principle is that when you have less space, you want to trade off the minor pieces in particular, because it just eases your cramp and makes it easier to find good squares for the remaining pieces. So my opponent played bishop e3, castles, following the main line here. And now I played this very trendy line that is one of my specialties that I have very, very good results with in blitz, having beaten a lot of GMs. And that's with this move, a5. So you might be wondering, well, Max, what exactly is the idea of a5? Well, often you see black play moves like queen a5, like this is the old school way to play it with bishop e6, rook c1 and queen a5 and rook fc8. The problem with this, however, is that after f3, rook fc8 and b3, well, black doesn't really manage to get any counterplay against these pawns. It's not really possible to get in a good b5 break. And as I showed in my old Dismaying the Sicilian 2017 book, after a6 and knight a4, white is thought to be a little bit better in this kind of endgame. And that's sort of why I tend to avoid these positions, because they're very, very safe for white. So that's why I played a5, where now the difference is that after his move rook d1, probably castles or f3 are more critical tries. Well, after a4, now I have this idea that I can sort of play the same plan that I just showed you with queen a5 and now bishop to e6. Probably you should go bishop d4 and queen e3 and try to prepare e5 if he wants to fight for an advantage. Instead, he played the move f3, but now after bishop e6, black is already in a very comfortable position. The key difference is that now when I play rook fc8, well, if he plays the usual move of b3 to defend, I can now take and open up the a file for my rook. So it's a very fancy idea and one that, if the beauty of it is you can play it virtually as a system opening. I play this in blitz and almost always get a very big advantage on the clock because my opponent is thinking about every single move what plan to play, whereas I can just play the first 15 moves almost no matter what they do. Well, my opponent found a pretty decent move here. He played the move knight to b5. It's worth pointing out that a move like knight d5 would not really have the desired effect, because after knight d5, it might appear at first that white is doing well because of the extra space, but I know from my experience playing this with both sides that the pressure on this pawn is actually quite significant. And with moves like rook c8 and bishop b5 coming up, black actually has very good piece play. And I've won a lot of blitz games in these types of positions where my opponent simply wasn't able to deal with black's very active pieces and the piece pressure against the queenside pawns like this. Because again, b3 is just helping black open the a file for the rook, as it were. So, in the game, my opponent played knight b5 instead. And I decided to keep the tension with the move rook fc8, not fearing the exchange of queens, because after all, well, my rook does get a bit more active, even if admittedly the rook does look a little bit funny on a5. It's not that obvious how white will actually punish it. In the game, he played the move rook to c1, and I just continue with my normal plan with knight d7. It's a very typical way to maneuver the pieces, because it activates my bishop to attack the pawn, and my knight can now come to much more active squares than was possible when it was blocking in the bishop on f6. So after knight d4, this is a point where admittedly I didn't play the best move here. I will say this was a game where I was very happy with the quality of my play, but this was one moment where I didn't play it as well as perhaps you can at this point. So what would be your move if you were black at this moment? Well, the move that I think I should have played here is the move of knight to c5. It's by no means the only decent move, but I think that it's a very natural square for the knight to simply blockade the c-pawn. Because if they go knight e6, I can simply take with the knight, and I'll end up getting a good knight versus bad bishop position. I can just put my knight or even my bishop on d4 to force the trade of my opponent's bishop pair. Of course, probably white shouldn't play knight e6, but then after rook fd1, I can bring my bishop back. And black is simply very solid here. I can sort of even play moves like h5 and maybe even think about a kingside pawn storm, trying to create some weaknesses in the white pawn formation on this flank. So I think it's a position that definitely is easier to play black despite white's seeming space advantage. Well, I played the move knight e5 instead, and as soon as I played it, I kind of realized it wasn't a very good decision. It was one of my few mistakes of the game. Because now after knight e6 and fe6, I mean, even a move like f4 and bishop g4 would be quite unpleasant, and that's what I expected him to play. Instead, he played the move of c5, which, may well be even a better continuation, or certainly is also a good move. Because, I mean, if I play d takes c5, well, actually, the idea is not to, is that the pawn sack, so white can go f4. It's kind of funny, I just realized, like, during the game, I thought white could simply take back the pawn. I actually hadn't realized that it was a pawn sacrifice. But it was a good thing I didn't take it, because after f4, we see it after knight 7 e5 that my bishop and knight are completely dominated here. And it's going to be very easy for white to pile up the pressure against my weak pawns. So it's a very powerful positional pawn sack by my opponent that, well, I was quite lucky that I didn't see I could take it, because otherwise I might have ended up in very hot water. So I played the move knight c6, which, for a computer perspective, is not the best move here, but I think it's a good practical try, because it sort of allows me to keep fighting for initiative by hitting this pawn. And I think my opponent didn't really handle this in a very good way. In fact, often the best way to deal with threat is actually to ignore it. And that's what my opponent should have done here. He should have played a stronger threat of his own with rook b1, fd1, hitting the pawn on d6, which is one of my main weaknesses on the half-open file. Because if black plays bishop b2, trying to get back the pawn, or trying to grab a pawn, well, he does succeed in doing so, but after the move rook c2, which is a lot better, by the way, than rook b1. Because if rook b1, black can then play a3, and then meet rook d6 with knight b4, and if black is able to get these connected passes, the position suddenly becomes very dangerous for white here. So the move rook c2 is better, and yes, it is a pawn sacrifice, but on the other hand, with the move rook b1, we see that the pawn on b7 is very, very hard to defend, because, rook c7 is kind of asking for different bishop moves to build up the pressure, but otherwise, I mean, it's kind of hard to defend this pawn on b7. I guess you probably see why rook b8 is a mistake, right? Yeah, well done if you found the key move, which is rook takes c6, and we use the pin to win a piece, just to make sure you've done your tactics puzzles for the day. Well, in the game he played b4, and it was quite fortunate for me that he defended in this, let's say, not ideal fashion, because after a takes and a takes, now I do have a very active play down this open a file. Keep in mind that my bishop does control this square, which makes it very difficult for my opponent to challenge this file. I remember here I was a little bit nervous about him playing bishop c4 at some point. I decided to play the move rook c8 first. I could have started with d5, but I decided to wait for him to play rook fd1. And then I played the move d5 here to try to push the pawn to center, which admittedly was probably not the very best decision objectively. The computer points out that I could have played rook a1 and used this very nice tactical trick where, just to show you it because it's really cool, the point is if rook takes d6, why don't you just trade the rooks on a1 and have equality? But now the point is I can play this very nice move of bishop d4. You could also play rook c1 and then bishop d4 if you want to. The point is that, well, if you play rook a1, then you run in a bishop e3 intermediate check, and then it's pretty clear, that black is just up a piece for nothing in this case. Or if bishop takes d4, black has rook c1, and, you just win the exchange and have a continuing attack on the white king. So that was probably the safest way to play. The good thing about d5 is that I was up on the clock, and this does keep more play in the position. So from a practical perspective, it's not such a bad decision to play this. After ef5 and ef5, yeah, my opponent could have benefited from a little prophylactic thinking. Prophylaxis is just where you try to anticipate what the opponent is going to do next turn. If he had played the move bishop f1, it would have taken all the sting out of my rook a2 idea. And yeah, I can play moves like d4 and try to push the passer. But in reality, if white even just moves the bishop to some square, we see it's very hard to get this pawn moving further, whereas white has a very good play on the light squares and I think would have a very small pull in this case. Instead, we have the move bishop b6, and, well, now we see the difference that I'm hitting this bishop. Admittedly, after bishop b5, when he played this, actually, at first was wondering whether I had gone a little bit wrong here, because he does have a lot of pressure against my pawns and my knight. The good news is I was able to find the very best move here to create counterplay. Can you do as well as I did? Well, there's actually quite a few reasonable moves here at this point. In fact, the first move I was going to play of knight b4. It's not the best move, but it's by no means a bad move either. But the move that I played at bishop h6 is a bit more unpleasant, because by kicking the rook, I sort of disrupt white's coordination just a little bit. Moves like rook c3 and d4 are a nice way to kind of get out of jail. So instead, my opponent played bishop c6. I realized that because bishop c1 and bishop b7 is going to kind of win a lot of pieces with tempo, that I should play the move bc6, that's simply forced. And on the one hand, yes, I am down a pawn, but I do get a lot of compensation. I played the move rook to b2, which was not terrible, but maybe bringing the rook this way might have been a better way to get the blind picks on the 7th. If I was wondering, the blind pigs are when you have the 2 rooks on the 7th rank, because they devour everything in sight, like blind pigs at the trough. So we had to move bishop d4. This was a good decision by my opponent, because even though I get the pawn back, it does mean that my rooks have been split. It's not so easy to actually get those rooks lined up, as it were. I was expecting my opponent would play some move like rook c7 or maybe rook d6. And then I think with ideas of white trying to bring his own rooks in, that definitely white, would be doing quite fine here. In fact, probably even has some marginally better chances, though with so few pawns on the board. It should be a draw with best play. Well, instead he went bishop e5, and I decided to go in with rook a2. A very ballsy move, going for trying to get my rooks into the attack in any way possible, and taking advantage of the fact that rook d5 would run into a rook b1 back rank mate. Which is why my opponent played the move h4, but, I wasn't done with my little grandmaster tricks, as you'll see. I played the move rook e3, again a very active defense, and the idea behind this is that if white were to play rook d5, he runs into a little tactic, where I can play the move rook e1, king h2, and then a nice move rook e5, with the point that rook e5 and bishop f4 would be a rather unpleasant fork against the king and the rook. It turns out even here, remarkably, that white is actually still holding if he finds this move of rook c8, and then after king f7, the move rook d7. The reason being that even though black is up a piece, white is going to take this pawn, and with only one pawn remaining, white will be able to eventually trade off that pawn and basically get a drawable rook versus rook and bishop endgame, where the 2 pawns obviously make it easier to draw. Well, he played the move bishop c7 instead, and that's where the wheels start to come off for white. Probably g3 was a better square for the bishop, even though it looks incredibly dangerous. Well, I played rook e2, going for rook g2. You had rook d5, rook g2. And remarkably enough, even this position is actually not dead for white. In fact, white is still holding. But keep in mind that white had almost no time on the clock, and that made it very hard for him to find the best defensive moves. I played the move bishop e3, threatening rook g1 mate. My opponent played rook d1, and then I continued to put pressure with rook gf2. Because, obviously I don't have rook h2 because of the bishop covering, but I can go around and try to attack him this way. Now, in a position like this, every tempo matters, and in fact, white had only one move to stay in the game, which he did not manage to find, but can you do better with white to play? Okay, congratulations if you found the move of bishop to g3. The idea of bishop g3 is that after rook f3, that it takes one move longer for black to get into checkmate, and that buys white the time he needs to go rook to c7, so that rook to g3 would run into rook d8 mate. And then white is sort of able to hold his own, because if you try to play something tricky like bishop d4, hoping for rook d4 and bishop f and rook f1 mate, well, I can then go rook e1, and then by renewing the mate threat, on the one hand, white is a pawn down, but after rook f7, it becomes clear that, white can even just sort of take, and, the pawn down ending is holdable, even if slightly unpleasant, because there are just not enough pawns to make anything of it for black, even with the white king being cut off like this. So instead, he played bishop to e5, and after rook f3, it turns out he just doesn't have the ammunition he needs to make the attack on my king happen, because rook h3 is a mating threat after all. So the game concluded rook d8, king f7, rook c7, king to e6, rook e8, king to d5. It's kind of important to avoid king f8 and king f5 and rook f8 skewers. He played rook d7, king c4, rook c8, and I stopped his little lawnmower attempt with bishop c5, and then I won on time. Although with rook h3 mates coming or rook f1 mate coming, it's clear that white's days were numbered in any case, the clock aside. So that was a very satisfying win, and probably one of the highest quality blitz wins I've actually had, despite my little error on move 17. I handled the rest of the game pretty well, I think, with no other real mistakes. So yeah, very satisfying win, and I think a very good model example for how to play these types of positions in the Accelerated Dragon, for those of you who like to play this as black. Let's continue on to the next game in my blitz session, where for all these remaining games I was playing against Floaty Potato. So let's see how this game went. I was white, and I once again played the move e4, because I didn't really play my best system in that previous game, so I decided to deviate and play the chess improvement repertoire of e5. To be honest, after this game, I am considering maybe I should change my main system to free knight c3 or even knight d2, because I had very good results with those lines in the past, back when I was playing them as a competing professional chess player. Now I just play for fun online. So after c5, c3, we had knight c6, knight f3, and often black will play queen b6 and try to pressure the pawn with bringing the knight around, but instead he played the move bishop d7, flexibly developing the queen side. Not bishop e2, he played this move f6, which is not meant to be a very good move, but it had been a long time since I actually had looked to see why that's the case. So after castles, we had fe5, knight e5, captures, queen c7, and I remembered that it was a very good move to play rook to e1 here, using the point that, of course, queen e5 would lose the queen to the bishop h5 discovery. I was expecting him to go castles, and in that case I was going to play this very cool idea, in fact. The idea is that you play the move bishop f1, and then go a4, knight a3, knight b5. Sometimes even if they go a6, and you get this very strong attack against the black king, as happened in a very nice game between Perez against Fernie, which I actually do analyze in the chess improvement repertoire. But in any case, instead my opponent played a deviation in knight e7, trying to revive the line in this way. And here I probably should be a bit more flexible and play a more aggressive move, like c4, clearing the way for knight c3, or if they do play d4, well then I get a very nice outpost for the knight on e4, and if they do take the pawn at some point, I will get a very strong initiative. Or, I can even just defend the pawn with f4, just knowing I have a very nice space to play with here. Whereas black seems to be very short carol play in comparison. So after knight e7, I went for a4, which, is not really a great plan, to be honest. I was sort of misappropriating the plan with black castling short. And g6 was a little bit surprising to me, but anyway, I was expecting to go knight c6, bishop e7, and castles as a bit more of a harmonious approach. I played knight a3. Really, I think it's a bit of a silly move, because if he goes a6, my knight just looks ridiculous on this square. That's why I should have put the knight on toward f3. But once he goes bishop g7, the plan kind of pays off, where I get in my knight b5, and it might seem a bit weird on the one hand to, trade off the opponent's supposedly bad bishop. But one thing I remember some grandmaster said is that bad bishops defend good pawns, or defend good pieces. I've got the exact quote now, but in any case, we had knight c6, and I kind of realized I can actually improve on the automatic move f4, defending the pawn. And I played the move queen to g4, gaining a tempo against this e6 pawn, and really fighting for the initiative, even in a close position. Although now that I think about it, maybe I should have actually played f4, because the continuation I played wasn't as good as I thought it would be in the game. I played queen f7, bishop e3 as white, hitting this pawn. And then after c4, I thought, okay, this is great. Now I go bishop c5, and suddenly he can't castle short anymore. So I thought this is just brilliant. And I was absolutely expecting my opponent to play bishop f8 to try to trade the bishops, which as it turns out is in fact the only really good move for black in this position. And now it's an instructive point that when you have this piece tension, you often don't want to be the first to take, because it just helps the opponent activate their pieces for free. Instead, a good move would be bishop d6, where I kind of keep this as a pawn in their side. Because now if they take, I get a protected pass pawn and pressure against this. So I kind of use the piece tension to my advantage in that case. Or, I could even better just keep the tension with queen d4 and use the pin on the knight to keep up some pressure like that. Well, instead my opponent played a6, and I kind of knew my position was very good here, but unfortunately I kind of lost control and sort of self-destructed. The move I played with rook ab1 is sort of a criminal move to play in such a position. Because after he plays rook b8, it's not really clear what my rook is doing on b1 if I can't get in b3. What I should have done is I should have played my original intention of rook e3. This is what I was going to play to go for rook f3, and I think the reason I didn't is because I was worried about queen f5. But what I had missed is if I just retreat the queen or even move it to d4, well, I'm ready to go for rook a1 and rook f3, or even moves like bishop a3 and queen c5 just prepare a very powerful penetration of black's position to a point where I think black is simply lost at this point. Granted, there are better moves than queen f5 like bishop f8, but still with rook f3, queen d4, white just has complete domination, and I'm getting into the weaknesses in black's camp. So if I play that, it was another game where I would basically win this, I think, if I just played a move I was going to first. But I kept talking myself out of good moves in this game, where after his move rook b8, I played the move bishop d6, which actually is quite okay to kick the rook. It was interesting to go b4 and kind of sack a pawn to open up the queen side. And it's actually the first move that I thought of, but maybe practically it would have been more effective to do that, in fact. Because after b takes, I can then go bishop d6, and it turns out once I move the rook to b7, that actually moves like queen e2 are very strong, and Well, I saw this idea of playing queen e2 and taking the pawn, but yeah, somehow I just didn't put it all together in the right way. Although now that I think about it, since I have bishop f8 and they can sort of consolidate by trading the bishop and castling, maybe bishop d6 was actually the right move and I just didn't follow up in the right way. Well, after rook b3, now I played the move rook to e3. Unfortunately, it's a mistake. I really should have played the move queen d4 and tried to invade my opponent's position instead. Because after rook e3, I played a very good defensive move here, where you might remember when your king is a lot less safe that it's often a good idea to trade the queens. And queen f5 was just very well timed here, because now, well, the threat to a rook means I don't have queen d4 anymore, compared to lines we saw before. So I kind of just played the ideas all in the wrong move order. After queen d1, my opponent played g5, which I didn't consider, but it was a very good move on his part. Because now after rook f3 and queen g6, well, he keeps the pressure on my rook. Although actually queen e6 is a mistake, and he should have kept the queen a lot more active on e4. Unfortunately for me, I didn't find the right move here, and it's kind of a bit embarrassing, actually, that I played it so badly. Because I kind of sensed that there was a good move, but I just couldn't figure out for the life of me what it was. I mean, the move I played at h4 is just completely self-destructive, unfortunately. But the best move is actually rook a1, which I know it looks like a completely ridiculous move, but the idea of it is that now I can actually move the queen to e2 if black doesn't take that pawn, because he's not hitting this anymore. So it's basically just purely a prophylactic move. On the other hand, if they do play rook takes b2 and take the pawn, well then my idea of playing h4, well, it's still possible, but probably I should just play h3 and sort of let him come to me if he wants. And in the meantime, I'm ready to invade his position with queen d4 and queen a7, or even queen c5 if he stops queen a7. And that's a very hard plan to stop, where I think that white is actually technically close to winning with such an idea. So yeah, this would have been a great opportunity, and I kind of sensed maybe I should just move this rook, but yeah, I didn't see the idea of queen d4 afterwards, which was kind of sad. And the result was that once again, after having a dominant position against this guy with white, I managed to somehow lose it after h4, which is, yeah, just a terrible move. So after rook a3, the problem is now after rook g8, he has a much better attack than anything I could possibly muster. And he kind of finished me off with some very strong tactics. You know, queen f1 was not the best move, but I was nervous about this bishop e5 idea. Going for the mate on g2. After queen g4, yeah, then I blundered again. Although by this point, white is kind of lost anyhow. So I played rook d1 and just completely missed bishop e5, and the rest was very brutal. With rook h4, queen h4, bishop e5, rook b2. I tried to go into swindle mode here and play rook b1. Unfortunately, what I missed is that, well, he has a very powerful combination to simply win the game before I could get even a hint of counterplay down the b file. He found the tactic rook takes g2, and after king g2 and queen e4, well, we see that white is losing the b1 rook on the next turn, and even the bishop probably as well. And so I resigned at this point. So yeah, yet another game where I got a dominant position and just completely choked, which was very unfortunate, but the good news is that at least these games were ones where, like, the games I was losing, I was sort of outplaying my opponents in part of the games, whereas the games I was winning in general, I was sort of, yeah, just playing much better. So it sort of gave me the confidence I could indeed, keep fighting and basically, stretch out the match with many more wins. So let's see what happened in this next game, now that I have saved this one for my Patreon members. So next game here was one where I was playing with the black pieces, which I was quite happy about, as you can imagine, because of the way that black had won every game so far. But as we saw, it wasn't really because of the colours, I think more just a coincidence. So I decided to go back to one of my old favourite openings against Floaty Potato, playing as white. So here I played the move c5, and after d5 I went back to my good old Benko with b5. So he decided to play the critical line, and he spent quite a lot of time actually on these moves, which made me very happy, because it told me that he wasn't really very prepared for the Benko, and well, it kind of showed in the way he played this. So after g6, knight c3, I've often played the Perunovic variation with bishop g7 and castles, and it's very likely actually I will be releasing a course on the Benko later this month, where you can stay tuned for that. But I decided to play the old main line with bishop a6 in this game. And I noticed that Jeffrey Zhang has also played this recently in Blitz. So after e4 takes, you might be wondering, well, why exactly do people not really play this line much anymore as black? And the reason is, if we play out this main line, that nowadays if you play the move knight bd7, then every man and his dog knows that the move a4 is just incredibly strong for white. And the idea of a4 is simply to defend the pawn and then put the knight on b5 and the other knight on c4. And when the knights are on these outposts, just completely blocks all the typical counterplay you get down the A and B files is just very bad for black. Unfortunately, I have a little move order wrinkle that I like to play, and it's one that my results have been quite acceptable with. And that's the move of queen to b6, which is kind of aimed against this move of a4, where now if they play a4, the idea is that you go knight a6, and, well, say that knight b5 is going to run into knight c7. Now, it's true, objectively speaking, the computers point out that if you play a5, and then go queen e2, that, white is just technically close to winning here. So it's true it is objectively not a miracle weapon, but in blitz, my opponents have very rarely played the right moves, because queen b6 has sort of taken them by surprise. So it's one of these lines where, yeah, objectively it's rubbish, but it turns out, practically speaking, you can get some good chances with it. Of course, if black were to play knight bd7, then, yeah, you would just transpose into the, into the lines with a low knight bd7. They're known to be much better for white. So, yeah, this is kind of like, yeah, this is where you are rolling the dice, but in this game it very much paid off, because my opponent was not ready for it. And after queen e2, I now played the move knight bd7, which, to be fair, actually, at this point, probably knight a6 or even queen a6 a more flexible way to play. I kind of like queen a6 because the general principle when you have these positions in the benko with the pawn down is that the endgames are actually quite nice for black, because somehow when the queens get traded, it becomes much easier for you to attack their weak light squares and to put pressure on their weaker pawns. So it's kind of a weird sort of gambit, because most gambits, the way you beat a gambit is just trade off all the pieces and convert the extra pawn to the endgame. But in the benko, it seems that every trade almost makes black's position stronger in a weird sort of way. It's sort of nice when you have these sort of positional or strategic gambits like this. So, in the game I played knight bd7. As you've probably noticed, my benko knowledge is more based on just a lot of experience playing the positions more so than knowing a lot of deep theory. Like, the benko is not really a super theoretical opening in that sense. So my opponent played rook d1. He really should have played a4, and then he would transpose to the very promising lines, with a4 that we saw a bit earlier. Now, I mean, again, I should have probably played queen a6, but for some reason I felt like keeping the tension with rook f to b8. And okay, now we decide to play a4, but as we will see, this might not have been the best timing of this move, and perhaps it would have been better to play a little more solidly first. But I can sort of empathize that white was struggling a little bit to figure out how to get this bishop developed due to the pressure down this file. Actually, at this point, I didn't really find the best move, and I invite you to see if you can find a better move than what I played here. In fact, it's a move that I've shown you before. It turns out that the move queen a6 is what I should have played here, with the point being that, of course, knight b5 runs into queen rook b5, and in that case, well, simply the pin on this a file is very unpleasant, of course. Therefore, white really should, I think, rather than trading queens and accepting all these weaks on the b file, he should probably go queen c2 and keep the queens on. But then black has many ways to get decent compensation. You can either play rook b4 and start to put pressure against the center and against the pawn on the b file, or my preference would probably be to play knight g4 first, because then later on you can kind of maneuver your knight to e5 and c4 and then have quite nice piece pressure to work with. Another good thing about knight g4 is if more pieces get traded, like say if the queens would be traded, then f5 often becomes a very nice plan to weaken white's pawn structure, and we're actually going to see that a bit later in this game as well. So I played knight e8, which has the idea that if he goes knight b5, I can play the move knight to c7 and simply trade off the knight. I guess one thing with the benko is at times, because I've played analyzed positions so much, I end up playing them like super fast on field, but sometimes it comes at the price of messing up my move orders a little bit, I guess. Though my results still been very good in spite of this little weakness of mine, so I guess it's a good advertisement for the opening. In any case, the game saw rook to a3, which is a very good move, by the way, to prepare knight b5. I played the move knight c7. Again, maybe queen a6 might have been better, but I thought knight b5 and in reply would be somewhat annoying. And unfortunately, why I'd overlooked is that actually after knight b5, I could now play the move knight c7 here, using the fact that he can't take my knight because his queen would then be left undefended. So it's a very nice tactical point, and it goes to show you can often learn from your wins as well as from your losses. So instead I played knight c7. I think if my opponent just placed queen c2 and b3, he would just be a solid pawn ahead, and black would struggle a little bit to demonstrate compensation. The problem if you go c4 is that you're kind of leaving that pawn just as a weakness to attack. So instead he played knight d2, and finally after 5 prompts I was able to come up with the best move of queen a6. I actually thought he might try and move like knight b5, trying to keep his extra pawn by tactical means, or at least to get back control of the position somehow. Then instead he played rook a queen a6, and I was extremely happy to see the queens come off, because now he doesn't have b3 because the knight is undefended, but he also has to contend with moves like rook b4, attacking the weaknesses. Now, one thing you might not know is I've actually played these type of endings many times against the chess.com bots, where I would notice they would sort of play quite badly against the Benko. So I started using different Benkos with black and even reverse Benkos with white to try to beat them. What would keep happening is against the strongest Indras, I would get this winning position by move 20 to 30. And that would just sort of seem to completely self-destruct and just lose like an idiot. The good thing is they got rid of all, like, dust off the cobwebs in a sense, getting rid of all of the stupid mistakes. So I could then play the games like a genius even in blitz games. And, well, I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but this was a fairly well-played game on my part, you could say. So he played the move knight f3, which I was incredibly happy to see. I was thinking that he would try some other move in the position. Even something like rook a2 maybe to try and, move the knight and prepare b3 and at least get some pieces developed. Then it would have been kind of interesting maybe to even take and, just try to get the pawn back, where it's a very thematic idea in the Benko. Then you get rid of their knight for the bishop, so you get back your pawn and have a good game from there. Instead, he played knight f3, and I recognized the tactical problem with playing the move knight f3. Namely that white's pawns are suddenly not so well defended, and I exploit that with the move rook b4. And again, that bishop c3 area suddenly, says hello once again. In this position, my opponent played bishop g5, and actually, I'm not sure if I handled this move in the very best way. The move I played was reasonable, but for some reason I had this complete blind spot and forgot that I could simply play the move king f8 here, which is often a good defense in these endings because it activates your king and still leaves white with the pertinent question of how on earth you're going to defend this pawn. And also these pawns are kind of, dropping off like flies as well once the c3 knight is taken. So I'd be very optimistic about black's chances there. Fortunately, one good thing about the Benko is because you are playing more for strategic compensation. You're not really always dependent on playing the best move to prove the compensation, because sometimes you have several reasonable moves because of the sheer flexibility of your pawn structure and your active piece play. So it turns out f6 you could say is the second best move. Certainly the idea of being able to take the pawn next would be very nice. My opponent tried to avoid that with bishop c1, but given that he's going to be losing a pawn anyway, this really is what he should have played. Because now after knight b6, that pawn on a4 is coming under heavy fire, and to be honest, I think white should just let it go at this point. Instead, he tried to hang on to everything like b6, but b3, it's kind of like, the person at the vendor, like, trying to hold, like, 20 mangoes, like, on the way back, and, you don't have a basket to put all the mangoes in, and, saying, well, all just go everywhere, and you can't hold any longer. Well, that's kind of what happened to my opponent, Floaty Potato, in this game. Or I guess we'd say 20 potatoes rather than 20 mangoes. So, after f5, well, simply the attack on the knight and on the pawn is very serious. And I was expecting my opponent would try to at least play e5 and give back the pawn, but at least kind of, cull the bleeding a little bit as such. But unfortunately, the hemorrhaging got a lot worse for him after bishop d2. I played the move f takes c4, which actually was a little bit imprecise. I should have played the move of bishop c3, and then rook e4, because the point is that then I get to take his pawn for free and just have this, monster set of central pawns just bearing down even in the endgame. It always feels good to have such a strong structure. Fortunately, fe4 is still pretty strong. And after knight e5, I actually found a really nice tactical idea, and I want to see if you can find it as well, because it just brings a smile on my face to see these kind of moves, and I'd say two smiles when I play it myself. So, congratulations if you found the move of e3. So, the idea of e3 is that, of course, bishop e3 is not a safe move here, because a bishop takes c3. But after fe3, that should be fe3, not f3. Well, actually, here I kind of messed up a little bit, in fact, where what I should have done is I should have played the move bishop takes c3, and then after bishop takes, I can take the pawn on d5, or even better, I can go rook g4 first to kick the knight away, and then take on d5, and I'm up. Actually, technically, I'm not up a pawn at the moment, but I will be quite soon, because after bishop d2, I do have the move rook e4 to fork the knight and the pawn. And then if they play knight g5 to save the knight, I have a little trick in rook e3. And I can kind of use the knight fork in that way. I mean, I saw the idea of the knight fork, but I got a little bit too excited in the game. And in the game, I blitzed out the move knight cd5. But then after knight takes, it got to this point, I suddenly realized, oh, if he plays this move of e4, then suddenly it's gone a little bit wrong for me. Because if I move the knight, well then he can take the rook, because he doesn't have to worry about the knight takes c3 fork anymore if the knight is not on d5. But if I play knight c3, which is what I'd intended, well it simply goes rook c1 and my knight is just basically trapped. after knight e4, bishop b4, then, c8, b4, which is why I intended, doesn't really work because of rook to c8. Like, I thought I was still holding even here. Like, this is why I was going to play this way. But what I missed is after rook c8 and bishop f8, that the move knight e6 is just decisive because I was threatening a rook f8 mate. That's a good example of the power of continuing to play with the attack rather than just automatically defending the rook without thinking. In any case, he played the move knight e6, and, well, then I was able to get what I wanted. I played the move bishop f6. Probably I should have played bishop to b4, b2, and got that tempo on the rook. So if the rook moves, I can at least, take the pawn. Okay, after knight f4, then we had this ending where, after knight f4, I thought he was going to play gf4 actually, but he ended up playing e takes. And admittedly, this ending is not anything too special for black objectively. Objectively, the position is probably only slightly better for black, thanks to the b-pawn being a little weak, and black's structure being just a little more solid with the bishop defending here. Fortunately for me, my opponent was well behind on the clock, where pressure I'd put under him did have an impact. I mean, it's one thing you might have noticed with many games, like on different channels, even my own channel, where, one player's been playing quite well for a while, and then it seems like just as they're about to get away with their draw for defending well, they sort of crack. And it's often what you see that if you just keep giving your opponent difficult decisions each turn, then eventually they will make a mistake. Well, my opponent played bishop to e1, which I thought was a weird move at the time, but it's not entirely silly to clear the way for the rook to defend the pawn. I played king f7 here. He played rook d3. Maybe rook b1 was a better move, actually, because it would allow him to go b4, at least try to make something with his past a pawn. At least I know it's what the computer bots on chess.com would have done against me. So at this point, I figured, okay, my position is quite good, where obviously his rooks are very passive, but how do I improve my position? And I don't think the move I came up with was the best one. I played the move g5 that, I mean, I like the idea of trying to get connected past pawns, but I think that it's actually quite hard to get those pawns moving if he takes. So, well, I'm probably still better after g5. I think that if I had this position and again, I would probably play a little more patiently. Maybe a move like king to e6 and, just get my king a bit more active, lend some support for a d5 push. And if they try to stop it with bishop f2, then, you can play rook a b6 or even moves like h5 and, just kind of steadily improve the position, keep the pressure against white. And I think that black would have very good winning chances, especially since bishop b2 is a threat to grab a pawn, and white probably has to split up his structure of a5 to, keep having a fighting chance. But already that's sort of an achievement for white to have split up his pawns into two weaknesses like that. It's not really connected past pawns in a split like that. Well, it wouldn't be anyway because of the pawn on c5, but you get the picture. So in the game, I played the move g5, and, well, it kind of paid off because my opponent didn't handle it in the best way. He went king f3, I took on f4, and he played g takes f4, not wanting to give me, connected past pawns. The problem now, though, is that the pawn on f4 is now isolated as a weakness, and we see why there's a lot of potentially weak pawns here. I played a move king e3, e6, simply with the idea of blockading on f5. He played rook a2. I think that at this point, white really had to go a5. I mean, it might look like a very loosening move, but I don't really have a way to get that pawn. I think that if my rook is tied up like this, it makes it much harder to try to win this as black. In fact, I might even have to move my king over at some point to try and make progress, just maybe have the king replace the rook as a blockader as my long-term plan. Well, he played the move rook a2, which I think was a mistake, and probably I could have been a little more alert and punished it with rook a b6. Because, I mean, rook a3 would run into rook bishop b2, which wins a pawn. But otherwise, it's kind of unpleasant to just drop the pawn like that. Well, I played a move king f5, which, okay, it's a mistake, but fortunately it didn't spoil too much in the game, because he missed the opportunity to go b4 and sack a pawn in order to, well, actually you could even debate whether it's a pawn sack, because after cb4 and rook b3, it's actually kind of hard to keep this pawn defended, because rook a b6 and a5 and a6 is, kind of unpleasant. I feel like white probably is able to hold the draw here with this sequence. I mean, b4 is kind of your dream pawn break as white in these kind of endings, because it gets rid of black's better pawn structure, because you basically, well, it mainly allows you to, just open up the position a bit for your pieces, which at the moment are not doing very much. Instead, he played rook d5, and, because he was behind on the clock and there was no increment, I was happy to repeat the moves once. And now I corrected my earlier mistake with rook a b6. Again, I think he has to go b4 to have any chance of surviving here, though it's definitely a much worse version now than it was before. Instead, he played rook e2 and kind of tried to go all in, but unfortunately he didn't have a good hand to play with. And after king g6, the checks run out, and, simply black's b pawn is, really a monster. It's perfectly supported with the rook behind the passed pawn, and the bishop stopping white from blockading. After a5, I played rook a6, rook e6, king f7, rook e3 and b3, and, my opponent was about to lose on time, and he resigned here. But okay, his position is clearly, inevitably going to be lost, because once a b pawn gets a b2, it paralyzes the rook, and white just has nothing after that. So quite a satisfying game for sure. It's true that the early phase is one I misplayed a bit. It wasn't a perfect game, but I was still able to play much better than my opponent and get a nice win. And I think it could be a valuable lesson for you as well to see that you don't have to play like a genius to win a game against a grandmaster. In blitz times, it's just a matter of just not making big blunders and just punishing their big tactical mistakes. So that being said, let's get on to the next game where I was feeling good. And this game I played with white was a weird one, and I really played it very, very badly. But somehow I was able to swindle my opponent and win. So it's kind of like the opposite, like with all the white games. Like when I got a much better position out of the opening, I would lose like a moron. And then when I play like a moron in the early phase, I end up winning it anyway. So it's kind of funny. Anyway, I guess it'll be a valuable lesson for you to see how I won. In case you're wondering, there are 2 games left in this blitz session, so you're getting close to the finale and the special announcement I have for you. So the game went d4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4, b6. So I was playing the London system. Again, one of my old favourites that you might remember that I played in the first white game before against that guy whose name I already forgot. So we had the move b3, e3 I should say. It's worth noting sometimes you'll actually see black play bishop e7 and kind of delay bishop b7 in order to go bishop a6 and trade off white's good bishop. It's quite a decent plan and one that I think deserves to be taken quite seriously. Fortunately for me, my opponent didn't do this, and he played the move bishop to b7 instead. Now after bishop d3, I think next time I play this, I'm probably going to go knight bd2, because I feel like it's a little bit of a more flexible move order in some ways, because there are certain positions where you may want to delay bishop d3 for a move or two. So I think this is the move I'll probably play in future, like castle c3 and, the usual sort of stuff that you play as white here. Well, in the game, I went bishop d3 and, well, I kind of knew that you should play the move h3, but for some reason I was very dismissive of my opponent, which was not really the best idea in retrospect. Because after knight bd2, he did know about the move of knight h5, which does win the bishop pair, and I think black's position is already slightly more pleasant in this case. I continued playing normally with castles, and I started to play a little bit creatively where rather than going bishop g3 and, going for this sort of structure, I decided just to let him take on f4 and kind of say that at least the double pawns do help me to control the center. However, c5 was quite a good move on his part, and definitely does make my life a little bit tricky, because the opening in the center does favour black's bishops. It's a very different story to if black has played d5, because then at least I get an e5 outpost to work with, or semi-outpost you could say. But now, black's position is definitely quite comfortable. I thought he would go knight c6 to just pressure the pawn in this way, but he decided to take first. Which I was kind of happy to see, because at least now I have a, half-decent kind of blockade on these dark squares. Unfortunately, my next moves didn't really leave a lot to be desired. After takes and bishop f6, well, I decided to develop normally with queen d2. I think I should have probably played my original intention of bishop e4 though. I'm not really sure why I didn't play it actually, because certainly it makes sense to trade off their bishop pair, and if they go d5, they're just kind of killing their own bishop. That's why I do think after takes that black still has quite good play, or even a move like b5, and going for a minority attack could be a nice way to have a slightly more pleasant game. Well, instead I went queen d2, and he could take and have a little bit of pressure, and I thought maybe that's what his idea would be, and it's probably what he should have done. Instead he played the move g6, which I guess is logical enough, but does maybe miss a small opportunity. Though admittedly I didn't really come up with a good plan. Again, I should probably go bishop e4, but so I played this weird a4 move, giving him another chance with bishop d4, which thankfully he didn't take. After a6, bishop f1. The problem is that white doesn't have a real target in this kind of position, and I really struggled to come up with a constructive plan. So not seriously seeing a way to improve my position substantially, I figured, well, the best thing was just to try to play solidly. So I went rook ad1, rook fd8, queen e3, rook ac8, and I kind of realized my knight was sort of getting in the way, so I played the move knight f3. And here I was expecting my opponent would just play some normal move like d6, and to have a vastly improved version of normal hedgehog, where he has the bishop pair and I have double pawns. Like, all of the differences are very much in black's favour here. Instead he played queen c5, which is actually not such a bad move here, but it didn't follow up in the right way. Because I was sure he would just play... Well, actually, that's not entirely true. Like, the reason I said that is because I remember after bc5, I felt like the game started to turn around after rook d6, which is why I played. But actually, it turns out if my opponent played bishop e7, that he would just be dominating here. My idea was that after rook b6, that, I would have some counterplay based on attacking this pawn, but it just doesn't really work. Like, even rook b8 just leaves me with a really horrible structure. After rook a6, rook b2, it's clear that, these pawns are going to drop off like flies, and, white is completely busted. Fortunately for me, he played the move rook b8, kind of sort of believing my little semi-bluff. Because I did sort of see bishop b7 was a good move, but I was hoping to kind of psych him out a bit. And after knight e5, suddenly things are not all that bad when I have this pressure against this pawn. I was thinking he would probably take and maybe go bishop c6 and, well, at least try to exploit my split pawns on the queen side to his advantage. But fortunately for me, he didn't do that. He played bishop c8 and, defend the pawn of rook d2. And we see it telling this pawn is a little bit exposed. In fact, the computer suggestion is a very hard one to find. It's a move I didn't consider and probably my opponent did it. If you really want to challenge yourself, you can try to find this move. No, because at least knowing it's a computer move helps you to find it a bit more easily. So my opponent could have played this move of rook f8, which I know it looks completely ridiculous, but the idea is that either black gets in the move d5, or if I do cash in on d7, the problem is that now, in this arising position, black is just better in this opposite colored bishop ending. Because the bishop goes to d4 and puts a lot of pressure against my f2 pawn, whereas my bishop can only really be used purely for defensive reasons, because these pawns just completely kill my bishop. It's funny such a little factor like that gives black such a nice advantage, but there you go. Well, he played the move rook a8, and unfortunately I completely missed the idea of this move. I think I should have really played b4 and start to get my create a pass pawn on the queen side at least. Instead I played rook ed1 and once he played d5 I felt like a bit of an idiot for not seeing he can now play d5, because that was the idea of rook a8 to make sure that knight c6 forks weren't possible. And again, probably b4 is the best try, but instead I kind of got outplayed here. It was a little bit surprising that he played bishop e5, so I thought he would just go bishop d7 and just trade off my bishop and just pile up on the weak b2 and a5 pawns from there. But instead he went bishop e5 and, well, after rook b8 I unfortunately didn't find the best move here. There was actually one idea that I kind of saw in the game, but I played too quickly and didn't really take it seriously. And that's this move of b4. And yeah, the idea is after cb4 that you have this move of rook b2, which, unfortunately, this is the move that I completely overlooked, even though I somehow sensed that b4 might be a good idea. Because either I get the pawn back and, he just stuck with a bad bishop defending a weak pawn, which is fixed in place as well. Or if he goes b3, I go rook db1, and so I get some play down this b file. Well, I get to control the open b file, basically. And even after d4, I can sort of feel that, it's a position that black should be able to hold, but I think that only white can really play for the win here. It is like rook b6 or rook b8 to hit the weak pawn, and, black has to find this move of rook d1 to meet rook b8 with rook c1, and, he has to find this pin in order to hold the draw here. So, b4, would have been a much better move. Because after f4, now things start to get a bit more difficult. Actually, a move rook d7 would have been a nice idea to be able to bring the rook to b7 later. But he played the move rook e8 instead, with king f2, rook e7. And yeah, here I start to go a little bit off the rails. I think I really should go rook b1 and try to insist on getting in this b4 push. It also serves a good prophylaxis against rook b7 to defend the pawn in advance. Instead, I played rook a1, which, is not a great idea. Though it does at least serve the purpose of defending both these weak pawns, which is nice. Unfortunately, I really misplayed it from this point, where I think I've managed to actually claw my way back to some kind of equality. But yeah, at this moment basically I should just play bishop e2 and just accept that the position is not gone my way, but that, it should still be equal, and if I just push the pawns, I should probably have some kind of fortress here as white. Instead, I played the move h4, which, okay, it's not the end of the world. I was going to play g3 and, just sit on the position and hold. But unfortunately for me, I made a mouse slip, where I mouse slipped the move g4, which is actually just a mistake, because now, well, the problem is that now this pawn is an additional weakness. And I kind of, overreacted a little bit in response. Even if I play like bishop d1 and put the king on g3, I think it's still a fortress for white. But instead I thought, okay, now I have to try to justify the mouse slip. And I played h5, and in principle, it's a good idea to trade off pawns when you're worse, but it doesn't really work when black has got a lot of threats of his own to play here. And with bishop d7, it suddenly dawned on me, okay, that's why I need to have the bishop on e2 to keep their bishop tied up. And now it kind of just went from bad to worse. After bishop e2, he played bishop b5. And okay, I should at least take and try to hold this rook ending somehow, but instead I just blundered with bishop f3, just completely missing bishop c4. Like I was so disgusted when I play, I was considering whether it was too early to resign. But I figured, if I can somehow, by some miracle, attack this f7 pawn then with rook h7, bishop h5, then maybe I'm still in it. So I just decided to fight and hold for as long as I could. Rook a1, keeping the tension. Because I know this guy was so prone to and susceptible to time trouble, so I was kind of playing against that. Now I think the most practical move for black is simply to go bishop d3, where you use the pin to get your bishop to a much better diagonal, and when your bishop on g6, white has zero counterplay, and black will simply take these weak pawns and win. So that would have killed all my swindling attempts, but instead he played rook 8 b3, which is still a completely winning move, of course, but I figured, okay, now I have to roll the dice with f5. And I thought he would just take, and I mean, if he takes, I'm just completely dead lost and would probably resign in a matter of moves. But instead he decided to take the pawn on c3. And while the computer will tell you this is still dead one, it gave me a sort of glimmer of hope. Because now at least I've got this fawn pawn where, if I can take this pawn could suddenly become a queen. So let's see how the game played out. I played rook b2, he covered it with rook b3, which actually wasn't such a great idea in some ways, because I was thinking, well, maybe I can try to hold the bishop ending, but then I realized I kind of can't. So I played rook c2, and, at least I managed to get a few seconds off his clock. Well, now he's taking my pawns, I really just have to go for broke. So we had rook c1, rook a5, rook h1, so going for rook to h7. In fact, here probably the most practical move at this point is just to play bishop d3. I mean, if he gets the bishop on g6, I have zero counterplay on the king side. And I mean, I could play a move like bishop h5, try and stop it, but then after king e8, my play is very slow. I mean, black is up 3 pawns, king f4. Could even be met with something like rook g2 potentially, and bishop g6 ideas. I mean, it should be a position that just, even if black just pushes the pawns, it should be an easy win. Because even if I do get to take this pawn, the counterplay will be too slow. Fortunately for me, my opponent started to drift a little bit, and after rook a3, king f4, well, he played bishop d3 now, which was a good move, but okay, I went bishop h5, and fortunately for me, he decided not to be practical. Although at this point, actually, it's already a bit tricky, because now king g8, e8. I mean, it's still technically losing, but at least I've got rook g8, and, I'm getting some real counterplay all of a sudden, and black has to be quite precise to win it. Well, he played bishop e4 instead, and, well, I played rook g1. I wanted to play rook g1 anyway, so I think this might have been a hallucination on his part. And already it's becoming quite tricky to actually win this as black. He played a move rook a4, which is one of the winning moves. But after king g5, something to play is quite complex. We had c4, bishop f7, and, well, now we have a bit of a race on our hands. I mean, black is obviously a lot faster, but at least I have some tricks. So after take c2. I mean, to my opponent's credit, he did manage to find, winning moves the whole way. At this point, I did actually miss a little opportunity where I maybe should have tried f7, but I thought if he just blockades with the king, I don't really have a way through. So I decided to try to swindle with rook c1. He played rook g4, and in this position it really should just be resignable. But the good thing is that my opponent had only 5 seconds on his clock. And it allowed me to basically just flag him in what you see here with rook a1, d3, f7. So I was just playing just to run him low on time was the idea. So rook d6, king c7, king e7. I thought he would promote to a queen and just try to get rid of my final pieces, but he tried to stop me queening instead. Went king e6, take. And then after queen c4, I figured there'd be some sort of tricky pre-move, so I thought, okay, I have 0.1 seconds on the clock, so let's go e6 as a kind of move that he's probably going to pre-move something bad against. And yeah, obviously king d6 is made in 5, but instead, yeah, he lost on time. So there you go, that was my win against Floaty Potato. As you can see, I was very lucky, and, I got completely outplayed up and down the board. Okay, in part it was due to mouse slip, but in a weird way, if I don't play that mouse slip, it probably ends up being a draw, and somehow I end up flagging him because of the mouse slip. So that was because I have an after mouse slip. So that was kind of a funny situation. So anyway, going into the next game, I had a rating of 2899, and I thought, okay, this is the time to get to 2900 plus, and remember that I can play chess after all, even though I haven't played much lately. So this was a game where I had the black pieces, and, well, considering how the results went for the previous black games, I was obviously very, very confident. And this game, had a lot of excitement to it, so let's see how it went. The game went d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, g3, so you decide, okay, I don't want to allow this wretched Benko, let's just play very solidly. So you play this fianchetto, and normally I'd play like d6 and these King's Indian systems in the past. But I thought, let's play a Grunfeld just for some variety. So he played the move c3, c4 is the main line, and after c6 white has a lot of different options from here, although queen b3 appears to be the main trend currently, with Firouzja recently playing knight e5 as well in a bunch of games. In any case, the game continued c3, and actually I didn't really remember any fury after c3, funnily enough, even though I have studied it briefly in the past. But I thought, okay, a move like bishop f5 can't be bad, just using the open diagonal. And he played a move a4, which to me is very hard to understand. I would have thought that moves like knight d2 and playing for the e4 push would have made more sense. But he went a4, which is a bit of a wasted tempo, I think. We had knight bd7, bishop f4, and I decided to play knight h5 here, which I think is not such a bad move, trying to clear the way for e5. He then played bishop to g5, and I played h6, and so far the play has been a bit weird, and neither side's piece placement makes a whole lot of sense. After this, I think I should probably actually play a move like c5, or even a move like knight hf6, because h6 is actually kind of a slightly useful move in that bishop f4 could perhaps be met with a move like g5 later, for example. Or I could go c5 if I want to kind of push in the center, but it also looks quite tempting. Instead, I decided to play very solidly with c6, which is also fine. And after a5, unfortunately, it was here that... Well, it turns out a5 actually blunders a pawn, but unfortunately, instead of grabbing a pawn, I ended up blundering one myself, which was very embarrassing. If you haven't seen it, then the answer is that black can simply go bishop b1 and just take the pawn for free, and it still kind of embarrasses me a little bit that a grandmaster like myself would miss like a 1100 tactic like this. But as it turned out, I ended up missing another 1100 tactic as well, where I played e5, and unfortunately after d5, knight e5, it was only at this point I realized, oh, now he takes the pawn for free. And I mean, now, the position is technically, it should be winning for white. But I thought, okay, and again, I can try to swindle him. I mean, it's kind of like the swindling session with all of the... Like, the pattern that this, match has gone has basically been, if you get a much better position out of the opening, you lose somehow. So it's kind of weird like that. Well, we had knight d2, and I thought, okay, my best swindling chance is to somehow whip up some attack on this open h file. So I played a move of bishop to h8, trying to keep the bishop out of harm's way. And also because I want to keep f6 for the knight, where my plan at this point was basically, get the king to g7, rook on h8, and hope for some miracle from there. Unfortunately for me, my opponent didn't really handle it in the best way, because he played bishop g5, and after queen d6. I mean, here he should just probably go knight d4 and prepare a c4 push, and white would have a very easy position to play, because he doesn't have any weaknesses I can target either. But he surprised me by playing this very submissive move of bishop f6. On the one hand, white is still up a pawn here. But on the other hand, at least I have the bishop pair, which sort of gives me some practical chances. And also my bishop was kind of looking really silly on h8, and now I don't have to worry about that. So I played king g7. Again, I thought knight d4 is what he would play, trying to attack the bishop and put the knight in a good square. Because, I mean, if I ever go c5 later, that pawn on d5 is going to become very weak. So knight is almost on an outpost, especially, considering the pawn structure. Well, he played queen b3 instead. I defend the pawn with rook e7. He played rook fd1, and, I kind of sense that c4 is kind of an annoying threat. So I decided to get the queen out of the way with queen c7. Probably I should have put it there to begin with, to be honest. He went knight d4. I played bishop g4, trying to break some sort of weakness. But he played rook dc1 instead, which actually was a bit of a mistake. I thought he would put the rook on d2 and maybe bring the other rook towards c1 later to support the c4 push. My opponent played very passively in this game, and I think it might have been nervous on his part. So I played the move rook h8. Actually, queen d7 was probably a better move, because I can go for bishop h3 and try to weaken his king in that way by removing the defender. In fact, I sort of was expecting my opponent to play c4, because he's been teeing up this for so many moves, and well, it also means he can now suddenly put a lot of pressure on my structure of a6. So this would actually be a very unpleasant continuation for black. Luckily for me, he played queen a4 and sort of bought me the time to consolidate my position a little bit. Well, I played the move a6 to stop his threat of a6, although in retrospect, queen d7 and going for the attack was a little more precise. Well, now he played c4, and Again, I sort of felt maybe this move wasn't the perfect timing, but it's not the worst timing either, I guess. So after dc4, I thought he would play rook c4 and try to keep his rook more active, against which I was probably going to just retreat the bishop to some square, maybe c8 to keep it out of harm's way. I mean, white would still be better in that position, but black would definitely have a lot of compensation now that the position is opening up for my bishop pair. Well, instead he played queen c4, and yeah, I played the move bishop d7, which was kind of just wanting to avoid any discoveries, but I think it was a bit too passive in retrospect, and probably I should be a bit more aggressive and just play rook e5. Because what I actually had missed is that if he goes knight c6, that I have this intermediate move bishop e6. So it turns out he's not actually threatening to win a pawn after all with this trick. And I mean, he can go knight e5. Like, it would be an interesting position to analyze. My conclusion is white should have full compensation. I mean, knight, rook, and 2 pawns is more than enough for a queen. But this version probably is about equal, just because black's got a decent coordination himself here. Well, the game saw bishop d7. He played a good move in b4 to fix my pawns in place. And now I really do have to go for the kingside attack. I mean, the move I played with queen e5 was a little bit sloppy, and I think that queen c8 again was a much better plan. It's kind of a bit sad how it's completely myopic, this whole idea of preparing the battery, but fortunately I won the game anyway, so it wasn't, something I'm going to regret for too long. After queen e5, he played the move queen c5, a move I hadn't seen, but it's actually pretty obvious to trade the queens when you're up a pawn. I played queen b8 to keep the queen out of harm's way, and after rook a2, I then played rook e5, and this is where I started going to swindle mode, going for the attack on the king. He played the move queen to c4, I played rook eh5, and then after h4, continue with g5. Now it turns out that actually the white king is pretty well defended at the moment if you put the knight on f3. For example, something like hg5, rook takes g5, and in this position there isn't really a big threat for black. Even if white plays rook d2 and just puts the knight back on f3 or e2, black is really very short of counterplay, and white would just be considerably better here with an extra pawn virtually for nothing. But instead he played a move bishop to f3, and I was kind of happy to see that, in fact. It turns out I actually missed a nice opportunity to sack the exchange with takes, because even though it's an exchange sack, I do get to rip open their king, and that should give black actually decent practical chances with the bishop pair. Instead I played rook 5 h6, keeping the material, and well, it shouldn't have worked out, but it did in the game, because here my opponent completely lost his sense of danger. What he should have done is he should have just played a solid move like queen c3, which defends the pawn and also lines up some nasty discoveries. And then white would effectively just be up a pawn with the better and safer king to boot. And those facts should give white the win with best play, but well, I guess the theme of this video has been ruining big advantages and turning them into losses. So instead we had queen c5, and well, I took advantage of my open goal with bishop takes e3, and okay, obviously fe3 and queen g3 is giving a massive attack on the king. It's something quite obvious even without deep calculation. So he played the move knight f5 instead, and well, after this at least he's not getting mated, but now suddenly, I'm not down material anymore, and he also was slightly behind on the clock, so I was able to use that to my advantage. I played the move rook g6, which actually was not a very good move. I didn't adjust very well to change structure. If I had, maybe I would have gone queen d6 in order to make sure I can parry any checks. Because if rook g6, queen e4 is a very annoying move because I don't want to self-pin, but also white is kind of in a position where his rooks can come in and really cause a lot of problems for me. In fact, even rook c5 is also quite a strong move to just kick my bishop and ask how I'm going to deal with this initiative. Because the fact that my king is more open is definitely a big advantage for, with queen and rook on the board. Well, we had bishop g2 in the game, which is very passive, and now I was able to correct my mistake with rook e8 and start to take some initiative for myself. After queen c3 and queen e5, I was kind of surprised by my opponent's next move, actually, because I was pretty sure that he was just going to trade, and say that this kind of ending is more or less close to equal. Even a move like rook b2 is just very solid. All the white pawns are pretty well defended, and they're also on the opposite colour complex to my bishop. That's why I think the position should be pretty close to balanced, even though black is admittedly a little more active than white at the moment. Well, instead he played queen c5, and I think that was a little bit of a strategic error. And okay, what would be your answer to this move if you're in black's shoes? Well, the answer is that I played the move rook queen c5, because obviously rook c5, rook e1 is leading to all kinds of problems for the white king. As such, you can see that the rook's just checked with tempo. After bc5, this is where I got a little bit careless, where my original intention was to play rook g6, and that's the move that I should have played. I then got a little bit nervous about rook b2, but actually after rook e7, it turns out that you can simply, well, just hold this position and use the bishop as a good defender, then the rooks are free to move. And actually black would have a very nice advantage, because once you trade off one pair of rooks, like with, say, rook e1 as such, what happens then is that actually white can't really defend both his pawns anymore, and I can start to even, start going after him in this kind of fashion. Well, in the game I played a move bishop d3, and my idea was to go bishop b5 and just kind of basically stop the b-file counterplay and then attack the pawns. Objectively, it's not a good idea, but it ended up working in the game, thankfully. Well, after rook d2, bishop b5, he went rook d7. And we can obviously the limitation of bishop b5, it doesn't really defend my b7 pawn from an attack. So after rook e2, I decided to sack the pawn, but at least in return I get good pressure against the king and active pieces. And in shorter time, my opponent was not really able to handle the attack very well. We had f4, rook g6, rook c3, and rook a2, just going after this pawn. And because my opponent was already way behind on the clock, he already started to go for broke with rook e3, which actually turns out to be a very good idea, because in these double rook positions, the piece activity is the most important factor. I played rook takes a5, he went bishop to h3, and I figured, okay, he wants to try and get the bishop into e6, so let's just stop that with some prophylaxis. The move bishop c4 also does a good job of attacking the pawn. He played f5, and, well, f5 I think was a mistake, and I took advantage with rook to a1. At this point I was playing very fast just to try to exploit my opponent's time trouble, so I played rook h6. Admittedly, I should have thrown in rook a2 and, just kick the king around a bit more, because if king f3 where I misses at bishop f5 would have been very strong then. Well, he played a move g4, and okay, again, I should play bishop d5, but, at this point it was a mad time scramble. And okay, I played it at this point. And yeah, it turns out that probably white should go rook b8 and start trying to play for some mating threats or something. But instead he went g5, and after rook h5 he had a long think. And fortunately for me, did not find the only move to keep to basically keep his pawn safe. If he plays king g4, I think white's perfectly fine here. I would be forced to retreat the rook back. And then with g6, white is getting sufficient counterplay against my king to maintain the balance. Instead, though, he blundered with king f4, and after rook a4, it turns out even this position is actually not lost for white, where if white were to play bishop f1, he would have some compensation based on or at least some drawing chance, we could say, based on the fact that white's pieces are active and there are not so many pawns left. However, it turned out my opponent lost on time, and with that it meant that I actually overtook my opponent's rating thanks to this win, and got a rating of 2907 blitz on chess.com. So there you are. It was a 1.5 hour video, but we got through my blitz session I played, and well, you got to learn also lessons that I learned from these games. So I think you really enjoyed these valuable lessons where you could say if there was one theme, we learned how to swindle the opponent. Always a good topic, which, well, it's not covered in that much in literature. Like, the only book I don't really covers in detail is David Smerd's The Complete Chess Swindler. And maybe it's because I read this book in full that I was able to swindle quite effectively in these games. If only I could convert my advantages as well as I swindle, then yeah, I would be all set, right? Well, anyway, since you enjoyed this video and watched it all the way to the end, I have a special announcement for you. Where if you enjoyed this video, I think you're going to absolutely love what I have to offer for you. So before I mention, also make sure to show your support with a like and a subscribe, and also leave a comment as well about your feedback on the video. It all helps me to make better and better content for you. So with that being said, my announcement for you is that I'm actually going to be sharing this this analysis that I've shared with you in a PGN, so in a chess file that you can basically replay in your own time in a chess viewer. So that way you can take as long as you want to, and just go over these games as many times as you like at your own pace. So really quality Grandmaster chess analysis of my own games, so that you can see my thinking process as well in the notes. So to access that, just click on the link I have in the description. That will take you to my Patreon page, where you can find a whole lot of my free chess content, like different blogs and posts and puzzles I've shared. And if you want to, you can also subscribe, and then for a small monthly fee, you can get access to my full chess content, all the different blogs, puzzles, and articles, and also chess analysis I've written, which, because of the way I've organized all the different themes and topics, forms a very powerful curriculum that will allow you to improve your chess every single day by learning from a grandmaster and my quality chess content. So that being said, I will see you on the inside of my Patreon page in the description below. Thank you so much for your support in watching this video, and I will see you in the next video, everyone.